Mark Carney did not step forward to announce a policy adjustment. He stepped forward to deliver a rupture in the structure of global trade itself. In a single, controlled declaration, Canada brought all bilateral trade with the United States to a full and comprehensive halt. Not in segments, not through selective tariffs or phased restrictions, not as leverage in an ongoing negotiation. Every category was included, every tariff line suspended, every export channel frozen, every import authorization revoked under executive authority issued by the Canadian Prime Minister, with a 30-day implementation window. What was announced was not simply a trade decision. It was the dismantling of the most deeply interwoven economic relationship on Earth, a system built over decades, where approximately $7 billion in goods and services moved across the border every single day, was now scheduled for full suspension. Roughly 700,000 jobs on each side of the border, directly dependent on that flow, were suddenly placed into a future of uncertainty by a single televised address lasting a little over 20 minutes. And yet the duration of the speech was not what defined it. It was the consequence. In less time than it takes to complete a typical commercial briefing, the assumptions underpinning North American economic stability were altered more drastically than at any point since the end of the Cold War. The President of the United States, a leader who had repeatedly assured the public that the dispute with Canada was under control and progressing toward resolution, was not notified in advance of the announcement. There was no privileged briefing, no diplomatic courtesy call, no internal alert that could have softened the impact. He learned of the termination the same way the world did, through live broadcast. And in the immediate aftermath, the reaction was not what analysts expected. There was no instant retaliation, no emergency statement, no rapid escalation in tone or policy, no coordinated media response from senior administration officials. Instead, there was silence. For 6 full hours, the White House, an institution built on continuous communication, rapid narrative control, and immediate political framing, issued nothing. No press statement, no social media response. No background briefing through intermediaries. 6 hours of institutional quiet from the most aggressively communicative political apparatus in modern history. That silence carried meaning of its own. It was not the silence of strategy. It was the silence of paralysis, of an administration confronted with an event it had been repeatedly assured could not occur under existing conditions. Every internal model, every risk assessment, every advisory scenario had treated this outcome as effectively impossible, and now it had occurred. Simultaneously, global markets began to react with immediate force. Within the first 90 minutes of trading, the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped more than 800 points, not as a gradual correction, but as a sharp accelerated repricing of global expectations. At first, analysts assumed the Canadian dollar would collapse under the weight of severing its largest trading relationship. The logic appeared straightforward: remove the dominant export market, and the currency follows. But as the second phase of market interpretation set in, that assumption began to reverse. The Canadian dollar stabilized, then strengthened. The reason was not emotional optimism. It was structural reassessment. Markets began absorbing the second half of Carney's announcement, the part that had not yet fully been understood. Commodity markets reacted next. Energy futures surged. Agricultural inputs spiked. Critical mineral contracts repriced almost instantly. The United States was no longer being viewed as a stable endpoint for Canadian supply chains. Instead, those supply chains were being reinterpreted as redirected systems, moving elsewhere, not disappearing. What had initially appeared as disruption was now being understood as reallocation. Within 12 hours, 6 central banks issued coordinated statements acknowledging elevated systemic uncertainty. The International Monetary Fund initiated emergency consultations. The World Trade Organization issued a carefully neutral but historically unusual statement describing the situation as unprecedented in modern trade governance and urging immediate multilateral dialogue. Notably, the statement avoided assigning blame. It did not accuse Canada. It did not directly reference the United States as an aggrieved party. That neutrality itself became a signal, one recognized immediately by financial and diplomatic observers as an attempt to remain above a rapidly shifting balance of power. Warren Buffett, when asked for comment, 4. Identified the event as more than a trade escalation. He described it as a structural separation, drawing a line between temporary economic conflict and permanent economic realignment. He made a distinction that reframed the entire situation, the difference between a trade war and a trade divorce. One can end in negotiation, the other ends in separation. 4a. But the true transformation did not lie in the termination itself. It emerged in the second half of the same press conference. In the 11 minutes following the initial announcement. 4. The narrative shifted from collapse to construction, because what was revealed next was not a retreat from global trade, but the activation of an entirely different framework, a 14-nation trade network, not theoretical. 4. Not proposed, not under discussion. Activated, negotiated quietly over 9 months, ratified individually by each participating government, and structured to operate parallel to the existing American-centered trade system. 4. This network included major global economies and strategically significant states: the European Union, the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, Mexico, Brazil, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. 4. Norway, Singapore, and New Zealand. Together, they represented a geographically distributed system covering every major economic region. Energy agreements redirected Canadian oil and gas flows toward new markets. 4. Critical minerals were rerouted into alternative industrial supply chains. Agricultural exports were repositioned toward Asia and the Middle East. Manufacturing inputs were integrated into non-American production systems. 4. Technology cooperation frameworks were embedded across AI, quantum computing, and cybersecurity sectors. The implication was immediate and severe. Canadian exports were not disappearing from global circulation. They were being reassigned, and that reassignment meant the United States was no longer the central recipient of those flows. It was becoming absent from them. Inside the press room, realization unfolded in real time. First, the first announcement had created shock. The second created reinterpretation. The presence of embassy representatives from all 14 partner nations, previously unnoticed by many observers, suddenly became clear. They were not symbolic attendees. They were confirmation of pre-existing coordination. The secrecy of the negotiation itself became a point of analysis. 9 months of parallel bilateral agreements, 40, conducted without detection by American intelligence or media channels, suggested not only diplomatic coordination, but deliberate structural compartmentalization. Each nation had negotiated independently with Canada, without full visibility into the complete architecture, until final ratification. This prevented exposure, prevented interference, and ensured that no single disruption could collapse the system before activation. The result was a trade network that emerged fully formed at the moment of its announcement. A completed structure revealed only when it was already operational. Markets, governments, and institutions were now forced to process a reality they had not modeled. Canada had not isolated itself. It had rerouted itself, and in doing so, it had also rerouted global supply expectations. Within 24 hours, 7 of the 14 partner nations issued public statements describing the arrangement in terms that carried unmistakable weight: foundational, structural, permanent, generational. These were not temporary descriptors. They were institutional signals. 3 nations used identical phrasing to describe the network as independent of any single external trade system. Language widely interpreted as a direct reference to the United States without naming it. That phrasing confirmed what analysts already suspected. The network was not designed as a reaction. It was designed as an alternative center. Additional countries soon began requesting entry. Chile, Vietnam, and Malaysia submitted formal interest. Within 72 hours, their motivation was not ideological. It was strategic positioning within a system that now appeared to be expanding through gravity rather than persuasion. Meanwhile, the United States faced a different reality. The loss was not simply bilateral trade termination. It was the simultaneous reallocation of supply chains into competing economies. 4. Energy flows previously integrated into American systems were now contractually redirected. Critical minerals essential to manufacturing and defense industries were now allocated to competing industrial bases. Farner, agricultural inputs were now supporting foreign production advantages. This created what analysts described as asymmetric disruption. The United States was not only losing access, it was losing access while others gained it. Internal American response mechanisms struggled to adapt. Traditional policy instruments, tariffs, sanctions, bilateral pressure, were no longer applicable in a system where the counterpart had ceased to be singular. The White House statement issued after 6 hours of silence reflected this limitation. It expressed regret. It expressed willingness to engage. It did not contain threats or countermeasures. That absence was not diplomatic moderation. It was structural uncertainty. For the first time in decades, the United States faced a trade environment in which escalation tools had no clear target. Even internal national security discussions reportedly reached a common conclusion. There were no viable response mechanisms capable of reversing the architecture that had been established. The system had already reconfigured itself around American absence. 48 hours later, the political tone shifted again. The president's public remarks were notably restrained. Assertions of strength remained, but aggression was absent. The language reflected not escalation, but adjustment to a new constraint, recognition that pressure alone would not restore prior conditions. In parallel, commercial consequences began extending beyond policy and into brand perception. Licensing partners began withdrawing. International agreements entered termination clauses. Reputational exposure shifted from volatility to structural loss association. This created what analysts termed brand flight, a self-reinforcing withdrawal dynamic in which exit accelerates exit. As remaining partners attempt to avoid being last in a deteriorating association, across financial commentary, Warren Buffett's interpretation became the dominant analytical framework. A trade war assumes eventual negotiation. A trade divorce assumes permanent separation, and in separation, there is no return to original structure, only adaptation. Buffett's final observation captured the central transformation. The global system had not fractured. It had reverse-centered. The United States had not been defeated in a conventional sense. It had been repositioned outside a network that no longer required its centrality. The 14-nation framework now generated its own momentum. Its own coordination, its own expansion logic. And as more nations expressed interest, the system began to exhibit characteristics of institutional gravity. What began as a bilateral rupture had become a multilateral realignment. And what emerged from that 22-minute announcement was not simply a termination of trade. It was the creation of a parallel economic order, one built not in opposition, but in replacement. And once constructed, systems of this scale do not revert, they evolve.